like. So we very well may go there with this next segment, to be honest with you, because
we're not going to rant.
Because we're going to talk about something that is somewhat controversial. Obviously, the healthcare law is controversial for me as a progressive. I saw lots of flaws in Obamacare, but I appreciated some of the great things that it did. I am of the opinion that the new Republican bill takes away the strength of Obamacare without really necessarily fixing any of the flaws. You have a different opinion. We're going to do our Opportunity Lives segment right now. We're not necessarily going to talk about the policy specifics, but we're going to talk about how you pay for it.
Right. We're going to talk about how we analyze it as well. And so I am super excited.
You love some data.
I love wonky. I love wonking out. And I'm really excited because as a Kennedy School grad, we now have the dean he was not my dean. I'm not going to hashtag not my dean. That's not me. But I'll forgive him because he was busy at the time.
Let's tell people what the Kennedy School
running.
is, because some of us did not go to Ivy League schools.
Okay, sorry. So the Kennedy School is the School of Government at Harvard University, and they specialize in data analytics. You go in and you learn about economics, just different policy analysis, how to think about policy and what it does to the people that you're governing. So we are so excited, and we're very privileged to have the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And before that, he was the head of the Congressional Budget Office. And we're going to talk more with him about what that means and its relationship to Obamacare and how we think about policy. So welcome, Dean.
This Doug Elmendorf.
Doug, yes.
Yeah. We'll call you Dean. But he has a name.
You can call me Doug. It's nice to be here. Thank you so much.
Yes.
And also, it's important to note you were the director of the Congressional Budget Office.
Yes.
Yes.
For 6 years.
Which is nonpartisan.
Absolutely.
And its job, if I'm correct, and I usually am not, but its job is to take a look at all of the laws that are potentially being passed within Congress and determine how much they'll cost and what impact they'll have economically and financially on the country and the government. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. And you're not partisan, and I think that's important to note, because just because Republicans are in charge of the House, they don't get to, or Democrats when they're in charge, they don't get to appoint this particular office so that they can skew the numbers in a way that makes their stuff look good. Is that accurate?
That's exactly right.
And so every true or false, I just want to get some backup because we got the two Harvard people here and then you got me. So I want to get some information. Every law that gets passed or every law that deals with money in Congress goes through this Congressional Budget Office, correct?
Yes, that's
And
right.
gets a score? How does that work?
Yes. The Congressional Budget Office will read a piece of legislation or the specifics of a proposal, not yet in legislative language, and will assess the effects of that proposed law on federal revenues and federal spending. It works with the staff of the Joint Committee on Taxation in some of these projects, like healthcare reform. The work that CBO does is strictly nonpartisan. It is objective. The agency does not change its mind in response to pressure from members of either party in Congress, and the agency works with both the majority and minority parties all of the time.
And they're equal members of each party on any committees, or is there a committee involved? I mean, seriously, I don't know.
No, so
I ran for Congress, but if I'd gotten there, if I'd won, I would have learned then.
No, the majority party, having more people in the Congress, has more people on each committee.
Right.
Both the House and the Senate, if
Right.
they're in the majority in both cases. But CBO works with both the majority and the minority, usually with the chairman and ranking member of the committees, like the Budget Committee, the Ways and Means Committee in the House, the Finance Committee and Budget Committee in the Senate.
So I think we want to talk a little bit today about the new replacement possibility, the proposed repeal and replacement of Obamacare. And to my knowledge, there hasn't been an assessment by the CBO yet. Is that correct?
Not that I've seen.
Does it usually take, is that odd? Is it normally something that people would have that information as soon as it's presented, or does it take a little while for us to get that?
Well, if a bill has been made public, then as soon as the CBO analysis is done, that analysis will be made public. But members of Congress can work with CBO on a confidential basis as they're developing legislation. So in the past several months, as I presume the Republican majority was working with CBO, I think there were probably specifications for proposals going to CBO and estimates of effects going back to Capitol Hill. But that was all confidential, as it's supposed to be. Now that legislation is in the public domain, as soon as CBO finishes an estimate, it will provide it at exactly the same moment to both the majority and minority on the Hill, and then we'll provide it to the public.
So, Dean Elmendorf, we're just so lucky to have you here because you can give us kind of, the behind the scenes about what happened with the Affordable Care Act, and then now what will be happening with the new Republican replacement. So can you walk us through kind of what happened while you were with CBO to the extent that you can discuss?
And
obviously,
who appointed you?
Yes. Yeah, so I was appointed at the beginning of 2009 when the Democrats controlled the House and the Democrats controlled the Senate.
Yes, because you're appointed by Congress. You're not appointed by the president.
Right.
Yes.
People make the mistake of saying this was, quote, under the Obama administration. It's not
Sure.
under the executive branch at all. It's under the Congress. I was then reappointed after the Republicans took control of the House. The Democrats still controlled the Senate, and Speaker Boehner and Majority Leader Reid reappointed me. But the first part of this was when I was working on healthcare reform with many, many colleagues at CBO. There were dozens of people who worked on this. We went back and forth with the committees, both Democrats and Republicans, and looking at healthcare proposals. And there were many, many, many estimates over the course of the year and a quarter that this bill was being worked on. And you can look them all up today still on the CBO website. So I've lived through a lot of this. And I feel a little sorry for my colleagues who are living through it now because the pressures are intense. And the pressures I'm thinking of are mostly time pressures. These bills of this sort are very complicated. They're very hard to predict the effects. But CBO's under a lot of time pressure to get that done because obviously people on the Hill are waiting.
Sure. Well, and I think that was the big, and there's a piece on opportunitylives.com. We can put it on screen just so folks can look up the headline if they want to go check it out. But it looks at kind of the history of what the Congressional Budget Office is, but also looks at how far off some of the estimates were about the budget and how much it would cost to pay for Obamacare.
Not putting you on the spot or anything. What was that all about?
But I mean, but it's not just, it wasn't just this. Obviously, this happens quite a bit. And so,
Yes.
I'm not trying to single this particular thing out, but the article does look at kind of, the estimates about who would be insured and how much it would cost. Like, why is there a discrepancy?
It's very hard to predict the effects of major changes in policy. Small changes in policy or changes we've seen many times before, one can predict the effects more accurately. But a sort of dramatic change on the scale of healthcare reform or immigration reform or large budget deals or other things that make a lot of changes in policy, it's just very hard to know what will happen for all of the expertise that CBO and its advisors bring to bear.
So most people, I would imagine, I could be wrong, I may be the only person who doesn't look up CBO analysis on everything, but most people probably don't. Can you give us an idea of, if there were and what they were, some of the predictions for Obamacare in its initial CBO analysis that didn't necessarily come to fruition the way the CBO thought they would?
Okay, so you should think of three major pieces of the Affordable Care Act. One is the expansion of insurance coverage through the exchanges and the Medicaid expansion. Another are large changes in Medicare. And the third are changes in the tax code. And the changes in the tax code and the changes in Medicare together added up to enough savings or new revenue for the government to slightly more than offset the extra cost of the subsidies based on CBO's original projection. To project the cost of the subsidies, we had to try to understand how many people would join the exchanges, how many would join expanded Medicaid, how many employers might stop offering insurance coverage because there were these new options for workers, and a lot of other aspects of behavior. So we got some things right, we got some things wrong. On balance, CBO was a better predictor of what would happen than a lot of people who were throwing bricks at us at the time, but we didn't get everything right. So one thing that happened was that fewer people signed up for the insurance exchanges than we had expected. I think there are a few factors there. One is more went into Medicaid than we had expected. And these were programs that were designed to sort of bump into each other, so there was some fuzziness about guessing who would go where. A second factor was that fewer employers stopped offering coverage than we had expected. We had not thought very many would stop coverage. And in fact, a lot of the criticism at the time was that we were wrong, that many employers would stop offering coverage. We said, no, just a small number. But in fact, that doesn't seem to have happened at all. So some of these people who didn't go to the exchanges have stayed insured at their employers. But it's also true that we thought that the mandate to have insurance and the penalties if you didn't, and the subsidies to help buy insurance would propel a lot of people into insurance. And not as many people were propelled, pushed, shoved, enticed into insurance as we had expected.
Do you analyze why that happens at any point? I mean, I'm assuming you take a look later on and say, okay, this is not happening the way we thought it would. Let's reanalyze and do another update to this?
Yeah, so CBO updates its projections for lots of parts of the government several times a year. And every time we have to confront what we've gotten wrong and why. And I've not been at CBO the last 2 years, so I don't know their latest updates to thinking. But what I just told you were assessments that we were forming in the 3, 4, 5 years after the law was passed. Can I add one thing that happened, which was the bill cost less than we had expected in terms of these subsidies for insurance. And that was partly because fewer people signed up, and it's partly because it looked less expensive per person than we had anticipated.
Sure. No, I mean, there's so many variables. I mean, you really are just taking a best guess faith estimate. I mean, and you're clearly very smart people doing it. But can you talk about a little bit about dynamic versus static scoring? Because that first explain kind of what those are.
Please.
Because that's a big criticism that I know a lot of Republicans have is that CBO should do more to be dynamic in its scoring.
Yes. So traditionally, CBO incorporates in its estimates lots of kinds of behavioral responses to legislation. So if you provide a subsidy for something, people sign up for it. If you take the subsidy away, fewer people sign up. If you change the law, employers might change how they act. State and local governments might change how they act. So CBO has traditionally incorporated its best assessment of what those responses would be, with one important exception, which is changes in behavior that would change the overall economy are excluded traditionally from the calculations. So if you decide to sign up for insurance because you have a subsidy, we would capture that behavioral response. But if you decide to work less because you don't need a job to have health insurance, you can buy it through an exchange, that would traditionally not be included in the estimate. Because if you work less, that changes the labor supply and changes.
That means it's
employment and
static. That means it's
The
changed.
term static, it's not that there are lots of things that we allowed to move, but some things were held static. Now, my own view is that CBO should do dynamic scoring for legislation that is important enough to move the overall economy. Right? Most of the bills that CBO looks at.
especially
Hold on, dumb guy question. So just let's dumb it down for me. Can I get a Harvard degree for this? Because I feel like I've qualified for one now. Dynamic scoring essentially looks at more variables than static scoring does.
Exactly.
Just to break it down for
Yes.
most of us. It looks at more variables,
You're
and you're
exactly
saying that it should, and you're saying that Republicans have said that it should look at more variables, sort of like you say, well, the unemployment rate is lower because people just stopped looking for work.
Bingo.
Which I don't necessarily buy, but we won't get into that today.
Or
But-
tax revenues increase because you lower taxes and businesses invest more.
So is there an argument that one scoring skews in one way versus to benefit somebody's argument?
I think it is an argument in some cases. Most legislation CBO looks at is pretty small by the scale of the overall economy. It might matter a lot for that particular national park or that region of the country or that narrow sector, but it's small for the economy. So the overall economic effects don't really matter. But there are some pieces of legislation, like healthcare reform or immigration reform, that are important enough, if done in a comprehensive way, that the overall economy can be affected. And I've written since I left CBO about the value of CBO, including those kinds of effects when it does estimates of big bills. And when I was there, we, as you know, reported our estimate of the effects of the Affordable Care Act on labor supply and thus employment. We reported our estimate of the effects of immigration reform as it was being debated on labor supply and wages and investment and the economy.
So if I am to want to have faith in the CBO estimate when this next comes out, but there's one type of scoring that makes it look better for the left and one type of scoring that makes it look better for the right. A, who decides which one you're using? And B, how am I able to have confidence in its accuracy if it's actually possible you can do it one way and make one side look better and one way and make the other side look better? Or am I completely wrong about that?
Well, you should have confidence because the people at CBO
smarter than me.
No, not smarter than you.
Yeah,
but they are trained and are experts at the issues they're studying. And they come at these questions with no preconception about what the right policy outcome is. They're trying to give their best assessment. You should not believe the number will be precisely what CBO says it will be, because nobody at CBO believes that. Nobody's more aware of the difficulty of this process and the uncertainties than the analysts putting the numbers together. In terms of dynamic versus static scoring, there are rules now that apply to what CBO does in this way.
Who adopts the rules? Who creates the rules?
CBO works for the Congress. So the rules are created by Congress in consultation with CBO because there is both what is desirable and what is feasible. And the Congress, in principle, wants CBO to spend a very, very long time and analyze every possible aspect of every bill except when they're trying to actually move legislation.
But
Then
do
want
they
CBO to go
change?
very, very fast?
Are the rules dynamic, or are the rules set in stone for 4 years because the term is for 4 years? How often do the rules change?
Well, the Congress is not for 4 years, so the
Sure,
term that
2
matters
years.
here is 2 years.
But so the rules.
Congress adopts rules, so the House of Representatives adopted a set of rules.
So we know that Speaker Ryan and Republicans tend to favor dynamic scoring. Have you heard from your colleagues that they already retained the majority, but
Right.
it seems like if the criticism was that you didn't do dynamic scoring and then you're in power, then why not just change the rule?
Well, so I think the Republicans did that to some extent, and I've not been there to watch what's going on behind the scenes, and we haven't seen such major pieces of legislation move until right now. So I don't know all the discussions that are going on around this.
Sure.
But remember, the changes in employment that CBO projected from the Affordable Care Act were not large by the scale of the economy. I think it was worth our doing that work. I think it was very important to show those effects. But these weren't dramatic changes in the economy. This was a fraction of 1% of the labor force.
And it was interesting because Nancy Pelosi seized on that and said, this is great because it actually means fewer people will have to work. And the Republicans said, that's terrible because we need people to work. So it seems like, can you tell us what that's like in terms of any little statement that you make, you know that it's fraught with political calculation?
Well, so after we released that analysis of the effects of the ACA on the labor force, I happened to be dropping my daughter off at National Airport, and I'm walking through, and I see one of those TVs you pass with the scroll at the bottom, CBO says. And I pulled out my phone, and the messages are piling up. But that kind of discussion is exactly why CBO should provide that kind of information. CBO can't decide what policies are right because those policy choices depend on values, and CBO has nothing special to contribute to values. We elect people to carry through on our values. CBO provides the analysis, the information, to make it an informed debate. And there were some people who think the ACA was great because it meant people didn't have to work. Others thought it was bad because it let people not work. That's for them to debate, and for us to try to urge our representatives to follow what we think. And CBO provided the right kind of information.
But to Carrie's earlier question about Republicans, Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell being in charge and having the ability to write the rules for how the CBO does its business right now, are they capable, whether they've done it or not, are they able to say you must use dynamic scoring on this because it'll make it look better for us? I mean, I don't expect you to be partisan and take a side, but I mean, legally,
Put him in a hot seat, Clay.
Yes, so
I'll take a side, but she should.
So the people who run Congress can set the parameters for CBO's work. But I'm quite sure that Speaker Ryan and Leader McConnell, as well as their counterparts on the Democratic side, understand the value and importance of having objective analysis from CBO, even if on a particular day with a particular estimate, CBO is in their way in some sense. And in my experience in 6 years of running CBO, sometimes we were in the way of one party and sometimes we were in the way of the other party. And nobody was shy about pointing that out. But it had no effect on what we did. That's just CBO's role, and people understand that.
Don't they then undermine it, though? I mean, hypocrisy is a shoe that's worn on both feet. So, I mean, I have many, many times seen the Democrats say, oh, the CBO is wrong about this, that, and the other. And at the same time, I've seen Republicans turn around and say about the exact same office, under the exact same leadership, oh, they're wrong, they're horrible. I mean, you piss people off on both sides most of the time, right?
True.
And if you're doing your job well, you're pissing them off equally.
Well, it depends on what positions they're taking. So it's not, we didn't have a target. There wasn't a quota of who we made mad, but we made lots of people mad at different times. But again, I think the members of Congress mostly understand that. They understand that particular pieces of legislation, they will have objections, but that they can't function without a CBO doing what it does, and they understand that. So I think if there's a moderate amount of complaining, that's par for the course. If there is a deeper, broader accusations or accusations of favoritism or accusations of ignorance on the part of CBO, those sorts of things would be terribly destructive.
If there's a moderate amount of complaining, par for the course, we're in good shape. Dean Doug Elmendorf, thank you very much for educating me. I will be coming for my degree in May.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
We appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Man, I feel at the same time smarter and a little bit dumber. Sometimes when I'm around people who just educate me so much, I'm reminded of how much I don't know.
No, I feel like I just gained a few IQ points. So.
Well, I lost them. Right along with my Oh, my stripe is back.
The stripe's
I haven't
back,
been-
yeah.
You've done a very good job, and
Good job, Ben.
keeping me from disappearing today, and it kept you from disappearing.
Well, and
too.
Bonnie Chichester says this is the critical input that we need. So, Bonnie, thank you for tuning in, and for everyone who's been involved in the conversation today. We've really enjoyed our guests. We had, I think, some great.
This was a great show. This was a great
yeah.
show. We had nice conversations, nice discussions. Nobody yelled. I didn't throw anything this week. That's always an improvement. We'll be back next week. Let's see if I throw something then. See you then.